Hello, I'm Jonathan Friedman, Admissions Director and Associate Professor at the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. An important aspect of IISHJ is providing adult learning opportunities and resources, along with our professional training programs and publications. I'm delighted to chat today with Rabbi Claire Bergen, an IISHJ graduate and Jewish educator who's involved with the Los Angeles chapter of If Not Now. Claire, it's great to talk with you.
Great to talk with you too.
What was your Jewish upbringing, and how did you find your way to humanistic Judaism?
Yeah, so we're both here in Los Angeles, so I'm going to be specific that I grew up at a conservative synagogue called Adat Shalom in Westwood. Yeah, so that was sort of that was my formal Jewish education all the way through Hebrew high school, was the religious conservative movement. And at home, I sometimes say that our actual religion was Yiddish music. I think it was also the Dodgers, but that's not as relevant to this conversation. And yeah, so growing up, there's a strong family history of my father's side going back several generations, actually also on both sides of being musicians and professional musicians and professional klezmer musicians. So the traditional wedding music, Ashkenazi, Eastern European Jewish wedding music. So that um, in a way was I would say they were both important, and actually the tension between what I heard in Hebrew school and what I heard at home was actually an important part of my upbringing.
Was the tension between the Hebrew and Yiddish language, between the secular and religious sort of frameworks, that sort of thing?
To the secular and religious, less so, because I think, like many families, mine was just sort of like, nominally religious. Like
Hmm.
we didn't call ourselves secular, but we did the holidays. We were certainly not observant in a traditional sense. But yeah, the Hebrew Yiddish. Yes. Yeah. So this is like a story that I've written about before that I brought home. I don't know, I was telling my father about the how I was learning Hebrew, and the generations are sort of long in my family. He was fairly old when I was born. His mother was a bit older. So yeah, he didn't understand why I pronounced the words the way I did. Because he was raised in sort of the uh with the Ashkenazi pronunciation before that change happened.
Yeah, I think these days people forget the sort of tensions around that since things have been so homogenized. But certainly for certain generations and certain periods of time, the way that even words are pronounced is such a part of one's identity and how one identifies as Jewish that I can imagine in a family where there are those different influences, and especially when the younger people are learning a different way, that would be problematic.
Yeah, or just sort of an interesting tension that brought up questions that I wanted to answer.
Yeah. So you're active in the Jewish social justice scene in Los Angeles. What inspires your activism?
Well, I just want to say that describing it as a scene makes it sound like a fun social, which I mean, there are aspects that it can be fun and it can be social, but it's work. It's definitely work. Yeah, what inspires that? Um, I would say that probably some family dynamics inspire sort of my, initial whatever it was that I sort of from pretty young was interested in wanting to make the world better. But I really always, in a lot of ways, connected that with my Jewish upbringing and with growing up in the 80s, and now my age. But it's important because thinking back to it, that was a community that was only 40 years after the Holocaust, so very much still processing that event and what it meant for us as Jews. And so I think from a young age understood that something about being Jewish had something to do with resisting oppression. And I have like a particular memory that I come back to now because I find that the Isaiah text, is this the fast that I ask of you? And um, Isaiah 53 is something that I remember hearing now, thinking back to it, like when I was in college and sort of learning about politics and sort of getting exposed to a lot of ideas and coming home and hearing those words in my conservative synagogue and making that connection. Oh, there's something here.
Was this also something that your family imbued you with in terms of their own kind of generational history or their own baggage that maybe they brought to you as a person growing up in Los Angeles?
So that's sort of the strange part of it is that I don't know of anybody else in my family um, who is or was as politically involved as I have become. So yeah, it's sort of a individual thing that I sort of ended up doing. Yeah.
Yeah, you're whatever the opposite of a black sheep, like the good version of that,
Thank
maybe.
you. Very kind. Also, we want to be careful about how we use color language and
Of
pos
course. Yeah, I hear you. So in the past, it was actually secular Jewish individuals and movements that dominated the civil and human rights spaces in the US. These days, I've noticed that the most prominent voices in those spaces seem to be more conventionally religious. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so okay, so in thinking about this, I have several different answers to this question. And I guess the first answer is that I think there's a big difference between Jewish individuals and Jewish movements. So you may be familiar with a certain presidential candidate who is Jewish, and as far as I know, Bernie Sanders is secular. I don't hear about him going to synagogue or sort of observing Jewish religious practices as much as I hear about his background as somebody from a family that immigrated from Poland to New York, much like my family. Um, and yeah, and being a social democrat. So first, there's that answer that there are still secular Jews very prominently in our movements. And I think as a group, so that's where kind of we get into the history of all this, that one reason that I think that has changed is that the movements, so I sort of skipped this part of my history, but I guess coming out of these childhood experiences of having these questions and sort of making these connections to what I was learning in my own Jewish education, I ended up exploring on my own in college and right after college this history of the Yiddish left, as I would think of it. So, and I think people of maybe older Ashkenazi generations may be more familiar with this, but sort of the history of sweatshop organizers in the early 1900s, especially in New York, but throughout not only North America, in other locations as well. So labor organizers, people doing rent strikes, actually a lot of women involved in starting those strikes and organizing them. So there's this important history of the Jewish left, and then we have the organizations like the Workers' Circle, at that time the Workmen's Circle, which does still exist. And then you had the JPFO, the Jewish People's Fraternal Order, which was split off from the Workers' Circle in the 1930s. And so the JPFO was really the further left, and a lot of this sort of Yiddish left kind of congregated around that organization and related organizations. That was dissolved by the US government in the 1950s, around the same time that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg uh, were executed for their alleged Soviet conspiracy. So um, that the combination of those very specific attacks on the movement itself and the more general move to this class movement that happened um, in part because of the success of the labor organizing, actually. The same working class, primarily immigrant or children of immigrants, in the early 1900s, now in the 50s, move to the suburbs and become middle class and go to college and things of this sort. So there's there's the direct attack on the movement itself, and then there's just a movement, like the change, the class change, and the change in the class identity of many Jews in the US. And yeah, I think because of all that, most people today in Jewish communities just aren't really very aware of that history. I think could have been intentionally repressed, and also yeah, because of just these more general changes. So um, all we have is what I think of as hegemonic synagogue Judaism. That's what I'm going to call it. So if somebody wants to be part of a Jewish movement, it's probably going to be based on that today because that's what there is in the US. Asterisk, there's other stuff happening too, but that's still the most well known.
Right. And, something that you mentioned reminded me, these movements that you're talking about that were the Jewish secular movements that were very progressive in their views of labor and civil rights, human rights, et cetera. I mean, they grew, in response to situational realities that they were living in. It wasn't religiously motivated. They knew that being Jewish marginalized them because of how society viewed them. but they weren't necessarily digging deep into scripture or liturgy to find rationale that would kind of inspire them to do this work. They were doing it because it was, part of their own experience. And even when we look at the 1960s with all of the Jews that were involved in the protest movements and so forth and so on, civil rights, etc., to a person, for the most part, they were responding to the Holocaust in a very real way, the experiences of their parents. And so when I was in Sunday school at a Reform synagogue growing up, all we learned about that period in the 60s was Abraham Joshua Heschel, right? So we had this rabbinic figure who was kind of mythical in his own way and very prophetic, right, in this religious mold and was a symbolic exemplar. And yet he was kind of the minority in these movements. And yet, again, just from this hegemonic synagogue Judaism that you talked about, like this is the person that we raise up. So now we see people who are maybe embodying that rabbinic, kippah wearing, talit wearing kind of persona at all these events that you're involved with. And a part of me feels like we've lost something along the way.
Should I respond to this?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the kippah wearing, tallit wearing persona, like what comes to mind are people who are actually genuinely mentors and role models for me. So I think part of my experience is sort of like being able to sort of, speak both of these languages that, from what I was raised in the religious community and now in the secular humanistic one. Um, yeah, I think also just to go back to this question of people having in the past, Jewish activists in the past responding to their own situation. If you want a really, really good book about it, Jewish Materialism by Eliyahu Stern. Um, yeah, all about that, but also all about how this is in the 1870s and in the Soviet, not Soviet, Russian Empire. Um, they were responding to their own experiences, but they also grew up going to yeshiva. So they really actually were. I mean, if they weren't like finding proof texts in the way that we do now, like I believe, so a very common one now would be to say, to talk about B'Tselem Elohim, this idea that uh, sort of the reason that we should, care about the humanity and honor the humanity and fight for the humanity of all people is because they are created in the image of God. So this is like kind of like a proof text, I would say, for this basic humanist idea. Um, yeah, that wasn't maybe so much the case, but they knew their Talmud.
Yeah, I think that again, like the Talmud doesn't necessarily push someone into this work if everything is hunky-dory. It's just fun stuff to study. But if you're not yourself or your family or your history sort of maligned, I don't know if you would be as compelled to actually highlight even a proof text if there were one for that. That's sort of my point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, I mean, this is sort of also like a lot of the writing and research I've done while I've been in school, like that we have other proof texts. We have the existence of the Bund, which is now sort of a meme, and people know it because of they know one specific image that's been spread around. But there's this enormous history with many books written about it. There we have the proof texts of our own history.
Right. Is there any beyond like the workers' circle and some existing I won't call them remnants, but existing legacy, let's say, from those earlier periods. Is there any organizational movement around reviving secular Jewish social justice activity?
Well, you read my thesis, didn't you? Actually, it wasn't really about that. Um, Yes. And as a matter of fact, that is really what I see as my work, and what the work that I am already starting to do and plan to do much more of as a humanistic rabbi involved in these movements. Um, yes, there were not rabbis in the past involved in these things, so we're mixing it up today. Um, yes. So one thing, I mean, there's so much I could tell you. The Bund has actually been revived. You can look it up online. You could join if you like. I'm not. Uh, I have no particular allegiance to its current, yeah, but it exists. This is the thing that exists. There was like, here, I don't think there's any reason I can't talk about these groups. There's a group called Rooted in This World. You can also look them up. So, yes, there's actually, and then, well, we can also look to Jewish Currents magazine. So this is an example, a really clear example of uh, a publication that came out of this Jewish leftist movement that sort of, started to shrink and have a smaller and smaller readership as we got into the early 21st century. And then they passed that leadership on to a younger generation of leaders. And it is now a very widely known thing. Now, is it secular? That's a different question. But this is an ongoing conversation. And this is, I think, I mean, this is where we are. I think we're having a lot of conversations right now in these movements about yes, I think these organizations are in the process of being revived. And as they're being revived, I think there are different needs that are being expressed by people who might potentially be their members.
Right. Uh, and so, what is there that might be unique being a humanistic rabbi such as yourself in these spaces? What is it that you bring to the table?
So I think what I have found, what I've learned so far, so I'll say very specifically, in the past 2 years, I have been actively involved in the Los Angeles chapter of If Not Now. I've been a member of Rabbis for Ceasefire since its founding. It was never meant to be founded as an organization that would last. We thought it was something that was going to be short, and here we are. Yeah, and not so more so in this local space that I've been in, though. I have found that little by little, I bring in these elements of this leftist Yiddishist culture, and I want to like actually pause right there and say we've had a very Ashken normative conversation so far. That is my background, and I don't know yours, but
Yeah,
um,
it's my background as
yeah.
well.
Um, so I may have just gotten myself a bit off topic with that, but that I have found that as long as I am presenting that as one part of our culture and our heritage and the heritage of the Jewish left, that it's not only very well received, but that people really want to learn more about it. So that's been a role that I've played, is that in movement spaces where there's a need, there's a desire for ritual. We can talk about ritual as humanistic rabbis. For observing holidays, we certainly do that. Um, as we do these things, and as I've worked in this in a group with other with other rabbis who are from other denominations, I found that it's been very meaningful for me to contribute elements of this history to and this literature and poetry and song and all of these elements of this culture to what we're doing.
So, of course, within humanistic Judaism, one of the main features is non-theistic language. Do you feel like you're having some kind of impact in that regard? I know, again, many of these contemporary activists are more conventionally religious. Are they changing their tone a little bit? They're using different words instead of, the standard vocabulary, that sort of thing?
So I would actually not necessarily agree that contemporary Jewish activists are conventionally religious. I think that they're coming into spaces where the only sort of access to being Jewish, doing Jewish things is in the
I
hegemony.
mean, rabbis specifically.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, the other
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, I've had a lot of really interesting conversations. That's what I'll say. And I think that in these conversations, I've grown and I've learned how to articulate what it is that I'm trying to do. And I think others have grown in understanding and sort of accepting and seeing the legitimacy of what I'm doing. And yeah, so very specifically, a group of us put together a high holiday service. Particularly Kol Nidre, we led this 2 years in a row, both last year and just this past month. And here in LA, and these were co-services that were co-sponsored by the If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace chapters. And in these services, there was both a need for, and I was able to provide um, readings, poetry, introductions to other readings that were humanistic, that did not include God language, and yeah, it
Wow, very
went well.
interesting. Yeah, cool. So how might you encourage other humanistic Jews who might be on the sidelines to get involved in the pressing social and political issues of our day?
Well, I'm thinking about this generationally because people on the side, because yeah, I would say that yeah, people who are actively involved in humanistic Judaism. And so also we haven't really talked about the difference between that and the sort of secular side of things that I've been talking about, but they are connected, but different movements. Um, So, talking to our communities, I would say start with what's meaningful to you. Um, don't, uh, I guess I would say that I think that apathy is sort of the opposite of humanism because if there's nobody out there who's going to do it for us, if, we can't pray to someone or some deity to do it for us, we've got to do it ourselves. And that can feel very overwhelming sometimes. And we don't have to do it alone. And that's really what I get from the history of the secular Yiddishist left, which is so communal. We do this together. So find a group that is working on an issue that you believe in, whether it is the environment, whether it is the issue of immigration, where I, I don't have to list them. There's so much going on right now. Find an organization that you believe in. You even donating money is necessary, very necessary. I can tell you, somebody part of these movements. Going to one meeting, bringing food to a meeting is such an important way to support a movement. There are all these small things really do add up. Um, yeah, yeah, and I'll say even I'll get really specific about it that for people who might not support the specific organizations that I have just mentioned in relationship to Israel-Palestine, there are organizations like Standing Together that are don't, as far as I know, take a position on the question of Zionism, but that are supporting the work of Jews and Palestinians living together and having a future in that land. And that is really important work. And there are Standing Together support chapters all over the US, North America, wherever you may be, where you're listening to this.
Well, thank you so much, Claire.
Thank you.
And to our audience, thanks for watching.